October 12, 1944. 6:42 a.m. Western Germany. A 30mm cannon shell tears through October air at 2,600 feet per second. It misses by 4 feet. 4 feet is the difference between an obituary and a legend. The man inside that cockpit is 21 years old. He weighs 155 pounds. He is from a town of 900 people in West Virginia, where the roads were unpaved and the winters were mean. He has no business being alive right now, and he has even less business doing what he is about to do next. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community and help us bring these forgotten chapters of history to the people who deserve to know them. 7 German fighters, 1 American pilot, 26 minutes. 90 rounds of ammunition left when it was over. This is the story of Captain Charles L. Wood Yeager, call sign Ace, and the most statistically impossible aerial engagement of World War II. A farm boy who taught himself to feel an aircraft the way a rancher feels a horse. A man who walked into General Eisenhower's office and argued his way back into combat. A pilot who on a cold October morning over occupied Germany chose to do the one thing that every flight manual, every tactical doctrine, and every rational instinct screamed against. He chose to fight. By October 1944, the air war over Europe was a mathematics problem written in blood. The Allied bombing campaign against German industrial targets had been running for 2 years, and the cost was staggering. In a single mission over Schweinfurt in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers and 600 men in a single afternoon. 600 men. In one afternoon. The Germans had turned the sky into a killing field, and they were extraordinarily good at it. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were the product of 4 years of brutal attrition. The weak ones were already dead. The men still flying in late 1944 were survivors, tacticians, and professionals operating some of the finest piston-engine aircraft ever built. The Bf-109 Gustav variant carried a 30mm engine cannon capable of tearing a B-17 apart in a single burst. The pilots who flew them had developed the Finger 4 formation, a tactical arrangement so effective that the Americans eventually abandoned their own doctrine and copied it wholesale. The solution to the bomber loss problem was the P-51 Mustang, a long-range escort fighter that could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But the Mustang was only as good as the men flying it. And by the fall of 1944, those men were dying at a rate that the Pentagon preferred not to discuss in public. The average combat life expectancy of a fighter pilot over Europe was being measured in weeks. Every mission was a negotiation with probability. Every morning briefing was a room full of young men doing quiet arithmetic about their own survival. Into this world on a frost-cold morning in October flew a 21-year-old kid from Hamlin, West Virginia, who had never dreamed of airplanes. Chuck Yeager did not grow up wanting to fly. Airplanes were things rich boys read about in magazines. What Yeager grew up with was precision. His father worked the natural gas fields, and the family had the particular relationship with scarcity that teaches a man to make everything count. Yeager learned to shoot squirrels at 150 yards before he was 12 years old. Not because he wanted to be a marksman, because missing meant not eating. That distinction between shooting for sport and shooting because the math demands it would define everything that followed. When the Army Air Forces tested him in 1941, the results were puzzling. His mechanical aptitude scored in the lowest percentile. He had barely seen the inside of a car engine. But his hand-eye coordination and spatial reasoning were in the top fraction of a percent. The recruiter marked his file with a single word: natural. He volunteered for flight training in 1942, not out of patriotism and not out of ambition, but because it paid $75 a month instead of $50. His flight instructor, a veteran barnstormer named Lieutenant Jensen, would later say that in 20 years of teaching men to fly, he had never seen anything like it. Most students learn to trust their instruments first, their altimeters, their artificial horizons, the gauges that translated the invisible physics of flight into readable numbers. Yeager trusted his seat. He could feel the aircraft through the leather cushion beneath him, through the rudder pedals against his boots, through the almost imperceptible shiver in the stick that told him a stall was 5 seconds away. He did not fly by reading numbers. He flew by listening to the machine. It was the same skill that had kept him alive in West Virginia, the ability to read a living system through direct sensation rather than abstraction. By March 1944, he had already been shot down once. Not in a dogfight, not in some cinematic explosion of cannon fire and glory, but by a German fighter that caught him looking the wrong direction over occupied France. His Mustang came apart at 18,000 feet. He bailed out into the Pyrenees, landed in a tree, cut himself down, and spent 2 weeks being passed hand to hand through the French resistance across the mountains into Spain. At one point, he carried a wounded American airman on his back for 6 miles through snow. He was 20 years old. He weighed 155 pounds. Regulations said he could never fly combat again. A pilot who had been on the ground in occupied territory knew too much about resistance networks. If he went back up and was captured, the interrogation that followed could destroy every French partisan who had touched him. The rule was ironclad. So Yeager went straight to General Eisenhower and argued his case in person. He was not asking for recognition. He was asking to go back to his job. Eisenhower made an exception. That single decision, that one conversation between a kid from West Virginia and the Supreme Allied Commander, set the stage for the most extraordinary 26 minutes in American aviation history. On the morning of October 12, 1944, Yeager was flying escort in a formation of P-51 Mustangs at 28,000 feet when a faulty oxygen fitting forced him to drop altitude. His wingman, Lieutenant Murray, stayed with him briefly before Yeager waved him back toward the formation. There was no point in losing 2 aircraft to a leaking hose. He planned to fix the issue and climb back to rejoin the tail end of the escort. Routine, manageable. Then the shadows crossed his cockpit glass. 7 Bf-109s dropped out of the sun. The oldest trick in the book. Attack from the east in the morning and the target is blind, flying directly into the blinding disk of sunrise, while the attackers have the darkness behind them. The Germans came in a textbook finger 4 formation, the lead aircraft already computing its firing solution. The wingmen spreading wide to cover every angle of escape. They had altitude. They had numbers. They had superior position. By every calculation that existed in every flight manual ever written, what they had was a kill. Yeager's body reacted before his brain did. His left hand slammed the throttle to the firewall. His right broke the stick into a diving turn so violent that his pencil and maps flew against the canopy above his head. The first burst of cannon fire ripped through the air where his cockpit had been, a fraction of a second earlier. The German pilot had calculated his lead perfectly for an aircraft flying straight. Yeager was not flying straight anymore. He pushed the nose down hard, trading altitude for speed, and dove for the deck. Every manual warned against this. Close to the earth, the margin for error compresses to nothing. A 50-foot miscalculation at 450 miles per hour is not an error. It is a funeral. But close to the earth formation flying becomes nearly impossible. The Germans would have to spread out. They would lose their coordinated firing solutions. They would start thinking about their own wingtips and the tree line below them rather than about the Mustang they were chasing. More importantly, Yeager had noticed something. By late 1944, the surviving Luftwaffe pilots were professionals, and professionals follow doctrine. The doctrine said that when you have superior numbers and superior altitude, you dictate the terms of the engagement. You do not follow the enemy down into the weeds. You wait. You make him come back up to you. Yeager was betting his life on exactly that. He leveled out at 1,500 feet above the pine forest of western Germany. He looked in his mirror. 3 of the 7 were following him down. 4 had held altitude as doctrine dictated. The formation had fractured exactly as he had calculated. But 3 Bf-109s at 1,500 feet is still 3 Bf-109s. The lead aircraft was already correcting its angle for a deflection shot. Yeager had perhaps 4 seconds. He yanked the stick into his lap and went vertical. Going vertical was counterintuitive to the point of madness. The Bf-109. Gustav had a supercharged engine tuned specifically for high-altitude performance. In a vertical climb, it should have eaten the Mustang alive. But Yeager was not climbing to win a speed contest. He was climbing to break the German pilot's firing solution. To force a man's nose to chase a target that was now moving in 3 dimensions instead of 2. The lead German overshot. His aircraft blew past with 30 feet of separation, his pilot fighting his own momentum, his nose pointing at empty sky. For 8 seconds, the German was blind. In aerial combat, 8 seconds is an eternity. Yeager rolled inverted at the top of the climb, hung upside down, with the German countryside filling his canopy, and pulled through into a split S. A complete reversal of direction that traded altitude for positioning. He came out of it pointed directly at the second German aircraft, which was still in its original pursuit angle, now suddenly finding the Mustang, not behind it, but in front of it. He fired a 2-second burst. At 300 yards, his 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns put approximately 200 rounds into a space the size of a dining room table. The second, Bf-109's left wing dissolved. The aircraft snapped, left rolled inverted, and went straight into the pine forest below. No parachute. 5 remaining. 12 minutes of combat remaining before his engine temperatures made the decision for him. 60 miles of German airspace between his nose and the Allied lines. 4 German pilots above him who had just stopped making mistakes and were about to start making history of their own. Yeager checked his ammunition. He checked his fuel. He checked the temperature gauges on the Merlin engine screaming behind him. Every number was worse than he wanted it to be, and the 4 remaining Germans regrouped angry, and no longer following doctrine, were dropping into formation above him with the focused patience of men who had just been embarrassed and were not going to allow it to happen again. What came next would be argued about in aviation circles for decades. Because what Yeager did in the final 14 minutes of that engagement was not in any manual. It was not in any training program. It existed only in the nervous system of a 21-year-old kid from a town with unpaved streets who had learned somewhere between the squirrel hunting and the Pyrenees and the meeting with Eisenhower. That thinking takes too long. In Part 2, we will walk through those final 14 minutes, second by second. We will see how one man with a nearly empty gun broke a textbook trap that should have been unbreakable. And we will find out exactly what was written on the last line of his logbook entry for October 12, 1944. 7 words that say more about courage than most books ever will. 14 minutes. That is what remained when we left Chuck Yeager above the pine forests of western Germany on the morning of October 12, 1944. 1 P-51 Mustang, 5 Bf-109s, an engine running hot, a fuel gauge moving in the wrong direction, and a 21-year-old kid from West Virginia who had just shot down one of the finest fighter pilots the Luftwaffe had ever produced using a maneuver that existed in no training manual on Earth. The Germans had regrouped. They had stopped making mistakes. And now, 40 seconds after that first kill, they were doing something far more dangerous than attacking. They were thinking. Here is a number that puts what came next into perspective. In the final 14 minutes of that engagement, Yeager fired his guns exactly 3 more times. 3 bursts. Combined duration of less than 4 seconds of trigger time. Against 5 aircraft. With 4 of those aircraft flown by men who had collectively survived over 2,000 hours of combat flying. What happened in those 14 minutes was not a gunfight. It was a chess match played at 400 miles per hour. And the man who won it did so by understanding one thing that his opponents never fully grasped. The most dangerous weapon in that sky was not the 30mm cannon on the Bf-109 Gustav. It was the silence inside Chuck Yeager's head. The four Germans holding altitude had watched their colleagues' aircraft vanish into the pine forest below. They had watched the Mustang execute a maneuver that should not have worked. They had watched the geometry of their formation, carefully constructed tactically sound, fall apart in under 2 minutes. They were not panicking. Panic was for men who had not survived 4 years of war. But they were recalibrating, talking on the radio, redistributing. And that recalibration, that fractional delay between observation and response, was the only resource Yeager had left that mattered. He checked his ammunition, perhaps 30 seconds of firing time distributed across 6 guns. He checked his fuel, sufficient to reach the Allied lines only if he stopped maneuvering within the next 4 minutes and flew straight and level the remaining 60 miles north. He checked the Merlin engine temperature. The needle was sitting in a place that his crew chief would have described quietly and with great personal restraint as problematic. Every gauge in that cockpit was delivering the same message. The arithmetic of this fight was ending. Whatever he was going to do, he needed to do it now. The 4 remaining Germans split into 2 pairs. 2 aircraft high, 2 aircraft low, separated by approximately 3,000 feet of altitude. A classic pincer formation covering every axis of escape. If Yeager climbed, the high pair had a firing solution waiting. If he dove, the low pair would drive him back up. If he turned north toward the Allied lines, all 4 would angle to cut off his escape, using their altitude as stored energy. If he turned to engage one pair, the other pair would slide into position on his 6 o'clock. It was textbook. It was airtight. It was the kind of tactical arrangement that junior pilots in flight school studied as an example of how to end a fight without risk. Yeager looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then he made the decision that aerial combat historians would debate for the next 80 years. He picked the low pair. Not because they were weaker. They were not weaker. He picked them because they were flying with a formation interval of approximately 200 feet between wingtips instead of the standard 300. It was a compression born of confidence. 2 experienced pilots who trusted each other enough to tighten up to reduce the gap to fly with the comfortable proximity of men who had worked together through hundreds of missions. It was a mark of professionalism. And it was going to kill them. 200 feet of separation meant that when Yeager dove at them head-on, not from behind, not from the flank, but directly at their faces at 470 miles per hour, both pilots would have exactly 1.3 seconds to make an individual decision about which direction to brake. There was no time for the radio. There was no time for coordination. Each man's nervous system would make its own choice independently. And if they made the same choice, if both broke in the same direction, their aircraft would occupy the same piece of sky simultaneously. At 400 miles per hour, that is not a close call. That is arithmetic. Yeager pushed the nose down and dove straight at them. The airspeed climbed past 450 miles per hour. The pine forests below him blurred into a dark green carpet. The 2 Bf-109s grew in his windscreen from specks to shapes, to the full terrifying dimension of 50 feet of German engineering aimed directly at his face. The left pilot broke left. The right pilot broke left. Their wings missed each other by a distance that witnesses on the ground would later estimate at less than 20 feet. Neither aircraft went down. But both pilots were now inverted. Disoriented, pulling hard to recover their instruments, spinning their horizons gone. Their minds entirely consumed by the image of their wingman's cockpit filling their windscreen at the speed of a bullet. They were out of the fight for 15 seconds. Yeager did not look back to confirm it. He pulled out of the dive leveled at 1,800 feet, pointed his nose north, and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Merlin engine overheated, and magnificent and profoundly unhappy about everything it had been asked to do in the last 22 minutes, responded with everything it had remaining. Glamorous Glenn III accelerated across the German countryside at 430 miles per hour, 20 feet above the tree line. Too low for the high pair to follow without trading their altitude advantage for a date with the ground. Too fast for the recovering low pair to close the angle in time. The high pair dove anyway. They had no choice. To let him run was to let him go. But diving from 7,000 feet to treetop level while chasing a target already at 430 miles per hour is not pursuit. It is mathematics. The mathematics said they would reach firing range approximately 40 seconds after Yeager crossed the Rhine River. He crossed the Rhine River with 38 seconds to spare. The German fighters pulled up at the border, not from any sense of rules, but from their own fuel calculations. They had spent 26 minutes chasing a single Mustang across western Germany, burning aviation fuel that the Third Reich was rationing like medicine. They turned east and disappeared into the gray October sky. Yeager climbed to 10,000 feet. He took a long breath of clean oxygen. He checked his instruments one by one, with the unhurried attention of a man who has just finished something that required his complete focus, and is now allowing his hands to stop shaking. The engine temperature was beginning to fall. The fuel gauge showed enough to reach the field at Leiston, with a margin his crew chief would later describe diplomatically as uncomfortable. He found his flight group's radio frequency and checked in. "Ace back," he said. There was a pause on the frequency that lasted long enough to mean something. "We thought you bought it," his squadron leader replied. "Not today," Yeager said. He had nothing else to add. He landed at Leiston Airfield 51 minutes after the engagement ended. When the ground crew chief climbed up on the wing and looked into the cockpit, he counted the ammunition cans. He climbed back down with an expression that mixed professional respect with something close to personal offense, as if the universe had violated an agreement he had not known he was part of. "Captain," the crew chief said, "you've got about 90 rounds left across all 6 guns. 90 rounds. 15 rounds per gun. Less than 1 second of combined firing time." He had landed glamorous Glenn III with the functional equivalent of an unloaded weapon. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Intelligence officers reconstructed every turn, every altitude change, every decision point, with the focused urgency of men who understood they were documenting something that should not have been possible. When they asked Yeager what he had been thinking during the head-on pass at the low formation, the moment that fractured the trap, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. "I wasn't thinking," he said finally. "Thinking takes too long." The official record credited him with 1 confirmed kill and 1 probable from the engagement. The confirmed kill brought his total to 6, making him one of the earliest American aces in the European theater of operations. He would finish the war with 11.5 confirmed kills, the half shared with a wingman over a German bomber that had the misfortune of entering 2 firing solutions at the same moment. He would break the sound barrier 3 years later on October 14, 1947, in a rocket plane over the Mojave Desert, the morning after cracking 2 ribs falling off a horse. He told almost no one about the ribs because he was afraid they would ground him. He used a borrowed broomstick to latch the cockpit door because his injured arm could not reach the handle. The man who flew through 7 German fighters on 90 rounds of ammunition flew faster than sound with 2 broken ribs and a broomstick. Chuck Yeager died on December 7, 2020. He was 97 years old. His wife, Glennis Glamorous. Glenn herself had died 17 years earlier. Among his personal effects, his family found his flight logbook from the European theater. The entry for October 12, 1944, was characteristically brief. Aircraft type, mission duration, rounds fired, outcome. At the bottom, in small, neat handwriting added at some point after the war, was a single note that was not standard logbook procedure. It read, 7 of them, good pilots, didn't quit. And then, on the line beneath it, 4 words. Neither did I. But the story of that October morning does not end in the logbook. Because what Yeager demonstrated above Germany that day, what he proved in 26 minutes, with a hunting instinct, a West Virginia squirrel rifle education, and a borrowed understanding of how fear works inside a formation, was something that the United States Army Air Forces had been trying to quantify and replicate for 3 years. And in Part 3, we will see what happened when the military establishment tried to turn one man's impossible instinct into doctrine. What happened when they decided that what Yeager did alone, they wanted every fighter pilot in Europe to do by committee? And what happened when the Germans, who had studied that engagement in detail, decided they had learned enough to build a counter? The answer involves a classified training program, a general who almost ended the whole thing before it started, and a morning over the Ruhr Valley in February 1945, where everything Yeager had proven was put to the final test. The war was not over. It was about to get considerably more complicated. In Part 1, a 21-year-old kid from West Virginia held off 7 German fighters above the pine forests of Germany with 90 rounds of ammunition and an instinct that no training program had ever produced. In Part 2, we saw what happened when the United States Army Air Forces decided they wanted to bottle that instinct and sell it to every fighter pilot in Europe. A classified training program, a general who nearly shut it down before it started, and a cliffhanger that ended with the Germans studying that October engagement in forensic detail, learning from every turn, every decision, every maneuver that Chuck Yeager had used to stay alive. The question we left you with was simple. What happens when the student becomes as dangerous as the teacher? The answer involves a February morning over the Ruhr Valley, a number that will stop you cold, and a lesson about institutional courage that the military establishment spent 30 years trying to forget. Here is the statistic that reframes everything that follows. Between November 1944 and January 1945, Luftwaffe intelligence analysts produced a 47-page classified assessment of the October 12th engagement. They called it Einzelkampfanalyse, Single Combat Analysis. They identified 11 specific tactical decisions Yeager had made. They categorized each one by its deviation from Allied doctrine. And then they distributed that document to every active fighter wing on the Western Front. By January 15, 1945, every surviving German fighter pilot in the European theater had read a detailed breakdown of how Chuck Yeager fought. They were not studying it to admire it. They were studying it to kill the next man who tried it. The Luftwaffe's response was faster and more sophisticated than Allied intelligence anticipated. German pilots began deliberately fracturing their own formations in early engagements, mimicking the disorganized appearance of a scattered group while maintaining radio coordination underneath. They were baiting American pilots into the kind of isolated low-altitude engagement where Yeager's instincts had thrived, then collapsing the trap with coordinated precision. In December 1944 alone, the 357th Fighter Group lost 11 P-51s to engagements that post-mission analysis described as tactically anomalous. The Germans were not flying doctrine anymore. They were flying a counter-doctrine specifically engineered to neutralize the Yeager method before it could be formally adopted. 11 aircraft, 11 pilots, in 31 days. The Luftwaffe had done its homework, and the bill was coming due. At Leiston Airfield, the classified training program that had grown out of Yeager's debrief was running into its own problems. The program, designated informally as Instinct Protocol by the pilots who participated, and never by that name in any official document, was attempting to teach 50 fighter pilots in 6 weeks what Yeager had developed across a lifetime of hunting poverty and structured near-death experience. The results were mixed in a way that polite military language could not fully contain. Pilots who learned the academic version of Yeager's tactics, the diagrams, the altitude calculations, the deflection shot geometry, performed marginally better in simulated engagements. Pilots who tried to replicate his actual decision-making process, the head-on passes, the deliberate formation disruption. The tolerance for impossible closing distances were getting themselves killed in training exercises at a rate that produced 2 separate written complaints to the base commander in December alone. Brigadier General William Kepner reviewed the program's preliminary results on January 3, 1945. He read the casualty reports from the 357th. He read the training incident reports from Leiston. He looked at the man sitting across his desk, who was Chuck Yeager, and he said something that Yeager would repeat in interviews for the rest of his life. "Captain, what you did works. What we're teaching doesn't. Explain the difference." Yeager thought about it for a moment. "Sir," he said, "you can't teach a man to stop thinking. You can only put him in situations where thinking gets him killed until he learns to stop on his own." Kepner stared at him. "That's not a training program," he said. "That's attrition." "Yes, sir," Yeager said. "That's what I've been trying to tell you." The program was restructured in January. The diagrams went away. The altitude calculation worksheets went away. What replaced them was a regime of increasingly violent simulated engagements at progressively lower altitudes, with progressively shorter reaction windows, designed not to teach specific maneuvers, but to compress the gap between perception and response until the conscious mind stopped being the bottleneck. It was brutal. It was expensive in aircraft and in men's nerves. And it was exactly 3 weeks away from its first real test when the Germans made their move. February 14, 1945. The Ruhr Valley. 0712 hours. A formation of 48 P-51 Mustangs from 3 fighter groups is escorting B-17 bombers toward synthetic oil production facilities near Gelsenkirchen. The target is strategic. German fuel production has been the primary focus of Allied bombing since the summer of 1944, and the Gelsenkirchen facilities are still producing enough aviation fuel to keep the Luftwaffe operational. Destroy them, and the German fighter force begins dying on the ground. The Germans know this. They are waiting. 63 Bf-109s and FW-19 rise to meet the formation. 63. Against 48 escorts protecting 42 bombers. The numbers are the worst ratio Allied planners have seen since Schweinfurt. But this time, 12 of those 48 P-51s are from Leisten. 12 pilots who spent 6 weeks being trained to stop thinking. Yeager is leading them. The Germans come in from the north. They split immediately into 4 groups. No finger 4, no textbook formation. They are using the fractured approach that their intelligence assessment recommended, appearing disorganized, moving in loose clusters that look like chaos but are maintaining precise radio coordination underneath. It is the counter doctrine. It is exactly what the 47-page Einzelkampfanalyse said would neutralize the Yeager method. Yeager sees it in the first 8 seconds. He keys his radio. Leisten flight, they're wired together. Ignore the visual. Listen to the gaps. It is not an instruction that appears in any manual, but 12 pilots who spent 6 weeks having their instincts systematically rebuilt understand exactly what he means. The gaps between the German clusters are too consistent. Disorganized pilots create random spacing. These gaps are uniform. Someone is maintaining them on purpose. The chaos is a performance. The Leisten flight splits into 4 pairs. They do not engage the outer clusters. They drive straight through the gaps, the maintained spaces between German groups, targeting the geometry of the formation rather than the individual aircraft. It is the October 12th head-on pass replicated 12 times simultaneously. The German radio coordination, which depended on each cluster maintaining its position relative to the others, collapses in 40 seconds. Pilots are calling warnings about friendly aircraft in their firing solutions. The frequency is overwhelmed. 3 separate German pairs nearly collide, avoiding Mustangs that are attacking from angles the counter doctrine had not anticipated, because the counter doctrine had been written about 1 man and 1 aircraft, not 12 men executing the same principle from 12 different vectors. In the first 4 minutes of the engagement, the Leisten flight accounts for 7 confirmed kills without a single loss. The German formation fractures into individual aircraft. The fractured Germans, now actually disorganized rather than performing disorganization, are isolated. The remaining 36 P-51s from the other 2 groups are trained in conventional doctrine. Against isolated aircraft, conventional doctrine works perfectly. 14 more German aircraft go down in the next 8 minutes. Total engagement duration, 19 minutes. German losses, 21, confirmed 9 probable. Allied losses, 3 P-51s, no bombers. The Gelsenkirchen facilities are struck without effective fighter opposition. Production at the primary facility is reduced by 68%. It does not fully recover before the war ends. The Ruhr Valley engagement is classified within 48 hours of its completion. Not because it failed, because it succeeded in a way that embarrassed every conventional tactical doctrine the Army Air Forces had been publishing since 1942. 21 German aircraft against 3 American losses is a ratio of 7-to-1. The average ratio for P-51 escort missions in the European theater was approximately 2-to-1. What the Leisten flight had produced in 19 minutes was 3.5 times the average effectiveness of every fighter pilot in the theater. The generals who had argued against the training program spent 2 weeks debating whether to acknowledge it. The pilots who had lost colleagues to the restructured training program had their own feelings about the cost. Yeager, when asked at the post-mission debrief what he had been thinking when he called the gap maneuver, gave the same answer he had given after October 12th. He had not been thinking. The distinction between a man who is not thinking because he is poorly trained and a man who is not thinking because he has trained himself beyond the need for conscious deliberation is the entire story of what happened over the Ruhr Valley on February 14, 1945. By March 1945, the tactical principles derived from the Leisten program had been distributed to 6 fighter groups across the 8th Air Force, not the full 6-week training regime. The institutions were not capable of moving that fast, but the core principle that coordinated formations are attacked through their coordination rather than their individual aircraft had become part of operational briefings from England to Italy. German after-action reports from March and April 1945 describe Allied fighter tactics as increasingly unpredictable in a way that the surviving German pilots found genuinely disturbing. One Luftwaffe pilot, captured in April 1945, told his American interrogator that the American fighters in the final weeks of the war flew as if they could read the radio. He meant it as a description of supernatural competence. He was describing men who had learned to read silence. The Luftwaffe flew its last significant fighter operation over Germany on April 7, 1945. By that point, fuel rationing had grounded the majority of its remaining aircraft. The synthetic oil campaign, of which the Gelsenkirchen strike was one component, had reduced German aviation fuel production by over 80% from its 1944 peak. Historians who study the air war's contribution to Germany's collapse generally cite the combined bombing campaign against fuel production as the single most strategically decisive factor in the final 6 months of the European war. The Gelsenkirchen strike and the fighter tactics that protected it is one entry in a very long ledger. But it is one of the entries that paid. Chuck Yeager received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the October 12th engagement and a Silver Star for his role in the February 14th operation. The citations described his actions in the careful, compressed language of official recognition language that contained the facts without quite containing what the facts meant. He added both decorations to a box in his closet and did not discuss them in public for 20 years. But here is what no one told you about what happened to Chuck Yeager after the war ended. What no one told you about the decision he made in October 1947, the broomstick, the broken ribs, and the thing that happened in the Mojave Desert that changed aviation history for the second time in 3 years. That story has one more chapter, and it is the chapter that the military establishment spent decades trying to keep as a footnote. In Part 4, we will find out what Chuck Yeager did when the war was over and the enemy was no longer German. When the enemy was the speed of sound itself. And when the only thing standing between him and history was a cockpit door he could not reach and a borrowed piece of cleaning equipment. The story is not finished. It has never been finished. And the final chapter is the one that matters most. From a West Virginia kid who learned to shoot squirrels because missing meant not eating to a 21-year-old fighter pilot who held off 7 German fighters with 90 rounds of ammunition over the pine forests of Germany. From that single impossible morning on October 12, 1944, to a classified training program that produced a 7-to-1 kill ratio over the Ruhr Valley in February 1945. From one man's instinct to a tactical doctrine that spread across 6 fighter groups and helped strangle the Luftwaffe's last operational capacity in the final months of the war. We have followed Chuck Yeager through 4 hours of history that most textbooks compress into a footnote. But the question we left you with at the end of Part 3 was not about the war. It was about the man. What happens to a person like Chuck Yeager when the shooting stops? What does the world do with someone whose greatest skill is a talent for surviving situations that should be fatal? The answer, as it turns out, is both simpler and stranger than anything that happened over Germany. Chuck Yeager came home in the summer of 1945 to Hamlin, West Virginia, population 900 unpaved side streets, and the particular quiet of a town that has been waiting for its young men to return and is not entirely sure what to do with them now that they have. He was 22 years old. He had 11.5 confirmed aerial kills. He had been shot down over occupied France, carried a wounded man through 6 miles of Pyrenean snow, argued his way back into combat in front of the Supreme Allied Commander, and participated in one of the most tactically significant fighter engagements of the European Air War. He arrived at the Greyhound station in Charleston with a duffel bag, 2 decorations he kept in a box, and the kind of quietness that settles over men who have spent years listening for sounds that meant they were about to die. His mother made dinner. His father shook his hand. Glennice, the real glamorous Glenn, was waiting. They married in September 1945 in a ceremony attended by approximately 40 people, which was roughly 4% of the entire population of Hamlin. Yeager did not give a speech. He was not a man who gave speeches. He was a man who did things and then described them in the flat, economical language of someone reporting facts rather than constructing narratives. The reception lasted 3 hours. He danced once. The Army Air Forces, which became the United States Air Force in 1947, was not finished with him. His record had attracted the attention of people at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, who were working on a project that most of the aviation world considered depending on their level of institutional conservatism, either the most important challenge in flight history or an expensive way to kill test pilots. The project was the sound barrier. The prevailing belief among significant portions of the aeronautical establishment in 1946 was that transonic flight was physically impossible, that the compression waves that built up on an airframe approaching the speed of sound created a wall of aerodynamic force that no aircraft and no pilot could penetrate and survive. Chuck Yeager read the technical briefings with the same expression he had worn reading German fighter formation assessments in 1944. He did not find them convincing. He volunteered. On the evening of October 13, 1947, the night before the scheduled attempt on the sound barrier, Chuck Yeager fell off a horse in the Mojave Desert and cracked 2 ribs on his right side. He told almost nobody. He was afraid they would ground him. The flight surgeon who examined him the following morning noted in his log that Yeager had complained of general stiffness and had been cleared for flight on that basis. Yeager had described his condition to the surgeon with the same precision he used for everything technically accurate, informationally incomplete. He was not lying. He was managing information the way a hunter manages his position. You do not tell the deer you are coming. On the morning of October 14, 1947, Yeager walked to the Bell X-1 rocket plane, which was painted bright orange and named Glamorous Glennis after his wife, with a spelling variation that has been debated by aviation historians ever since. His injured arm could not reach the cockpit latch. He had thought about this problem the night before, and solved it with the particular resourcefulness of a man from a town where you fixed things with what you had available. He borrowed a 10-inch section of broomstick from the maintenance hangar. He used it as a lever extension to pull the cockpit handle closed. The ground crew who watched him do this did not ask questions. They had worked with test pilots long enough to understand that certain questions were not invited. At 0624 hours, the B-29 mothership carrying the X-1 reached 45,000 feet over the Mojave. Yeager dropped away from the bomb bay, ignited the rocket engine, and began his climb. At approximately Mach 0.997, the needle on the Mach meter began to fluctuate in the way that all the engineers had warned about: the transonic buffeting, the control surface reversal, the moment where the aircraft began making its own decisions. Yeager felt it through the seat, through the rudder pedals, through the stick. The same way he had felt glamorous Glenn III telling him things at 18,000 feet over France 3 years earlier. He did not fight it, he listened to it. He eased the horizontal stabilizer trim and flew through it the way a man walks through a door, not by forcing it, but by understanding the geometry of the opening. The Mach meter settled at 1.06. He had broken the sound barrier with 2 cracked ribs and a piece of someone's broomstick. He described the moment in his post-flight report in 11 words. Stabilizer trim effective in transonic region. Aircraft controllable throughout. Flight nominal. The man who had described 7 German fighters in his combat log with the phrase, 7 of them, good pilots, didn't quit, brought the same economy to the most significant single flight in human history up to that point. The report read like a grocery list. The achievement it documented changed aviation forever. The tactical principles that Yeager had demonstrated over Germany did not disappear with the Luftwaffe. They evolved. During the Korean War, American F-86 Sabre pilots flying against Soviet-built MiG-15S over MiG Alley in 1950 and 1951 applied a version of the formation disruption doctrine, attacking the coordination of enemy flights rather than the individual aircraft, with results that produced an overall kill ratio of approximately 10-1 in favor of American pilots. Military historians who have studied the connection between the 1944 Leisten training program and the Korean air engagement tactics describe the lineage as direct but poorly documented, the kind of institutional knowledge that travels through people rather than through manuals, because the people who understood it best were also the people least interested in writing things down. In Vietnam, the connection becomes more complicated and more instructive. The United States Navy's establishment of the Naval Fighter Weapons School at Miramar in 1969. The program that became known as Top Gun was a direct institutional response to the recognition that American pilots in Southeast Asia were achieving kill ratios far below what their aircraft's technical superiority should have produced. The analysis that drove the creation of Top Gun identified the same core problem that Yeager had identified in Kepner's office in January 1945. Pilots were flying doctrine instead of flying situations. They were thinking when they should have been reacting. The solution that Top Gun implemented, the compression of reaction time through repeated high-stress simulated engagements at progressively shorter decision windows, was structurally identical to what the Leisten program had done in the winter of 1944. The names were different. The aircraft were different. The problem and the solution were the same. After Top Gun's graduates returned to combat operations in Vietnam, the Navy's kill ratio improved from approximately 2.4-1 in the early years of the conflict to 12.5-1 in the final operational period. That is a 5-fold improvement driven almost entirely by training methodology rather than technological advancement. The aircraft were not better. The pilots were trained differently. They had been taught in the direct institutional lineage of what Yeager had demonstrated in 1944 to stop thinking 1/2 second sooner. The broomstick that Chuck Yeager used to latch the X-1 cockpit on October 14, 1947, was returned to the maintenance hangar at Muroc Army Airfield the same morning. Nobody recorded its location. It was used to sweep floors for approximately 6 more months before being discarded in a routine facilities cleanup. It is not in any museum. It is not preserved anywhere. The most consequential piece of cleaning equipment in aviation history was thrown away by someone who did not know what it had done and would not have believed it if they had been told. The logbook entry for October 14, 1947 exists. It is held in a private collection. The entry is 4 lines long. Aircraft type. Flight duration. Maximum speed achieved. Condition of aircraft upon landing. At the bottom, in the same small, neat handwriting that had added a note to the October 12, 1944 combat entry, there is a single additional line. It was not standard logbook procedure. It reads, "Sound barrier, softer than expected." Chuck Yeager died on December 7, 2020, at the age of 97. Pearl Harbor Day. He had lived long enough to see the aircraft he flew become museum pieces, the tactics he developed become doctrine, and the doctrine he helped create become the invisible architecture of every military aviation training program in the Western world. He had lived long enough to watch Top Gun become a movie, and then a sequel, and to decline politely, and without explanation, every request to comment publicly on either. His wife Glenise, for whom he had named 2 aircraft and 1 chapter of aviation history, died in 2003. His family said that in his final years, he still woke before dawn. He still watched the sky. He never stopped paying attention to it. From a boy who learned precision because scarcity demanded it to a pilot who rewrote aerial combat doctrine because instinct demanded it to a man who broke the sound barrier because the problem demanded it, and his ribs were not a sufficient counterargument. Chuck Yeager touched 3 separate chapters of aviation history, any one of which would have been sufficient to define a life. He did all 3 before he was 25 years old, and then he went home, married Glenise, and declined to discuss it. The total number of pilots whose training lineage connects directly or indirectly to the tactical principles he demonstrated on October 12, 1944, is not a number anyone has formally calculated. It runs into the tens of thousands across 8 decades of military aviation. The number of missions those pilots flew, the number of aircraft they brought home, the number of people on the ground who never knew that a kid from Hamlin, West Virginia, with 90 rounds of ammunition and a hunting instinct, had quietly rearranged the mathematics of their survival. Those numbers are beyond counting. If this story reached you, if you spent 4 parts with a man whose name you may not have known this morning, please share it in the comments below. Tell us if someone in your family flew the P-51. Tell us if someone worked the factory line that built the Merlin engines. Tell us what this kind of history means to you, because we read every single comment, and we build these stories for the people who understand that the most important chapters of the past are almost never the ones in the textbooks. Subscribe if you haven't. There are 100 more stories like this one, waiting, each of them belonging to someone who deserves to be remembered. The sound barrier is softer than expected. So is history when someone finally decides to tell it straight.